Hey everyone, I'm currently working on installing the Aerosport products center console and throttle quadrant setup. This is a new design from Aerosport, and the big feature now is that they are integrating a custom throttle quadrant directly into the armrest. The setup allows you to have all the engine controls right at your fingertips as you're sitting in the plane with your elbow resting on the armrest. It's going to be a real convenient setup. It also maintains the stock location for the fuel valve. However, it is going to be maybe about 2 inches higher. I'm using the and-air fuel valve, and they have an extension available that allows you to move the actual selector up from where the valve is mounted. My valve is mounted down in the stock location, which is a few inches below the tunnel cover anyways, so I'll just have that just a few inches longer than I would have otherwise. This sits, like I said, 1 inch or 2 higher than the tunnel to allow clearance for the engine control cables. The control cables are going to get mounted directly to the tunnel cover and come back to the quadrant. Once the control cables are forward of the panel, they're going to go up and through the firewall in the stock locations. The cables will obviously need to be quite a bit longer than stock, and the measurements for those cables are available on the Aerosport products webpage. Some other features, it has an indent molded into it for the quadrant throttle lock. It has notches for underneath the armrest lid that allows you to run your headset cables into the console so they can plug in here, and you can have all the spare wire and kind of the bulky cables all hidden. There's actually a little shelf in the insert that allows you to screw the headset jacks right in there. So again, they're nice and out of the way. This setup is designed to mate up with the Aerosport lower panel. This is going to sit on the tunnel, again, right about like that. Everything matches up nicely, so it'll look like one solid unit when everything's done. The first step we're going to do is we are going to cut out the area here to allow the quadrant to come through. It is pre-marked from Aerosport, so it'll be a real simple thing to cut that out. We're going to get that cut. We're going to set this on the tunnel, figure out where it's going to be fore and aft, and then we'll use this as a reference for where the quadrant needs to be mounted. Once we do that, this will actually bolt to the tunnel cover, and then this will slide over and attach in the stock tunnel cover. It'll attach with the stock tunnel cover screws. So I'm going to get started. Okay, so we've got our hole cut in the top of the console for the quadrant, and we've gone ahead and installed the rubber gasket that comes with the kit to provide a nice finished edge inside that hole. Once that's done, we needed to drill a hole in the recess for the friction lock. Also, because of the way the friction lock bolt comes out of the bottom of the quadrant, you need to cut a little slot in the inset there, just to give you some clearance to slide the console over the quadrant. So you can see how that protrudes there, and because of the stiffness of the carbon fiber, you can't really just pull it apart and set it down over there. I'm going to end up making a little metal plate that sits in there, held in place with some double-sided tape, just to close that up and have a nice finished look in there. All this is going to be obscured by the seat, the passenger seat here anyway, so it's really not a big deal one way or the other, but yeah, I'm just going to do a little plate in there to hide that even more. Once you have that cut, you can go ahead and get the console match drilled inside the plane. What you're going to do is, with the tunnel cover in place, you can just set the console on that, and you're going to slide it forward so it sits up tight against the lower panel. And the bottom of the carbon fiber is going to be even with the bottom of the tunnel cover flange. that's going to be your height reference point, and then your front back reference point again is going to be your lower panel. Once you have it all located, I used a strap duplicator to drill all the holes that match up with the holes in the tunnel cover. I purposely skipped the back holes in the tunnel cover just so I could put the stock flush screws in there. That way, when I mount the tunnel cover first, I can get a couple screws to hold everything in place while I'm installing everything on top of it. One other trick is the Quadrant has a T-handle on the throttle. To make it a lot easier taking this on and off, because you're going to have things on and off quite a few times in the process, I'd recommend just taking the bolt and pull that T-handle off. It makes life a lot simpler installing the console over the Quadrant. So yeah, we're going to get that match drilled and we'll see what's next. Okay, so the next step is going to be mounting the Quadrant onto the tunnel cover. All this would have to be done in the plane. I'm doing it out here just so I can show you a little more clearly. But what you're going to do is you're going to pop off your console, and I put just a little bit of masking tape in the general area where the Quadrant's going to go. That gave me a nice surface that I could mark with a marker on and see it clearly. But what I did is I took my Quadrant, and with the console upside down, I set the Quadrant in place, lined it up pretty close to where I wanted it. You know, what part of the, based off of what part of the Quadrant I want exposed in that window. Flipped it over, and then I took some Gorilla Tape, duct tape, a really strong duct tape, and I duct taped the Quadrant to the console so that it, you know, I mean, it's not real precise, but it pretty much kept itself in place where I wanted it. I then took the console with the Quadrant taped to it and popped it down on top of the tunnel cover. At that point, pop a few screws in the console so everything's located properly. And then you can look in through the opening of the top here, and you can see where the feet of the Quadrant hit the tunnel cover. There are adjusters on the side. The feet have some up-down adjustment in them, so you're going to want to loosen those up so they're going to sit all the way down. But when you have your Quadrant up in place, you can then just with your hand reach in and with a marker mark where the feet are hitting the tunnel cover. Once you do that, you can pop the tunnel off, or I'm sorry, pop the console off and set your Quadrant back down, align it to those marks, and you're going to know where you need to drill the holes. The feet are slotted, so you have a little bit of adjustment in there. What I found is that the Quadrant has to basically be as far over to the right side of the tunnel cover as it can be. It's almost the same width as the tunnel cover, so it's, I mean, we're talking, you know, less than maybe a quarter of an inch difference here, but it's pretty tight against the right side, and that's just because of the way the slots in the Quadrant line up with everything. But once you have that figured out, you can drill through the tunnel cover and bolt things in place. You will still need to go through a few iterations of on, off with everything just to make sure you have the height of your feet set properly and that the Quadrant sits tightly up against the console. But once you do, you should have a nice tight fit between the upper plate of the Quadrant and that rubber gasket that you installed around the opening. And everything will be locked in place, and then we can go on to the next step. Once you have the Quadrant bolted in place, then you need to figure out where you're going to put your cable guide. The control cable guide is a little bent plate that gets mounted to the tunnel cover, and that's going to give that secure location for the control cables to mount to before they connect up to the Quadrant. It is designed with a slight gap between two of the cables, and that's going to allow those cables to straddle the extension for the fuel valve. So to position that, because of the position of that gap, I lined that that bigger gap. I lined that up with the hole for my fuel valve, again, so the cables would straddle either side of that. And then in the plane with the control cables fed through and going through the range of motions, I figured out exactly where fore to aft it should be mounted for the way my cables are installed. In my situation, I have almost exactly 4.5 inches between the front of the Quadrant feet and the back of the control cable bracket. So once I figured out where that went, drilled through, and you get that bolted in place. The last thing you need to do is figure out where you're going to mount your fuel valve. What I've done is I've taken the tunnel cover out of the plane and I've just put a couple of screws through the console into the tunnel cover to make sure everything's in place. And if you flip it over, you can just use the hole, the stock hole in the tunnel cover, which I needed to enlarge a little bit. It's in the exact same location as stock, just opened up a little bit to allow the and air extension to go through. So use that hole and just real carefully drill down through the carbon fiber, and that's going to give you the center point for your hole. Then you'll need to come back and open it up to fit around the base of the and air valve, and at that point you'll just follow the and air instructions from there, and when you're done you'll have a nicely centered valve.